So one of the architectural and theological characteristics of a lot of churches is high ceilings, right? In our own homes, if we have a great room that has a high ceiling, what do we call it? A cathedral ceiling, right? Yeah, it comes from the cathedrals. It started in, somebody else had a smart aleck remark that I missed. What was it? Go ahead.
You said, what would we call it? And I said, great room.
Oh, great, yes. Yes, great room, yeah. So the point of a church having a high ceiling or a cathedral is for, as soon as you enter the space, your eyes and your spirit are drawn upward. It's a whole orientation toward God. And as architectural techniques in the Middle Ages grew to the point where they could build taller and taller, they would do just that. And you'd have these huge spires, and we would be drawn further to God. Now, in the West, we had arches and flying buttresses and all those sorts of things. In the East, in the Orthodox Church, ceilings were high, but the emphasis was not so much on the height as its vastness. If any of you have ever been to or seen pictures of the Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom in Istanbul, used to be Constantinople, when you walk into that, there's this vast dome. It almost looks as though it's kind of floating over the whole building because there's a row of windows underneath it, so it just sort of looks like it's not supported by anything. It really reminds you of the heavens just being right over top of you. And if you've been in any Orthodox churches in general, you'll know that at the top of the dome is usually a figure called the Pantocrator. It's Christ sitting in judgment on the throne. And the understanding is that heaven is right there, and that as we worship down in the sanctuary, the saints above are worshiping simultaneously in heaven. It's a pretty cool thought, and it's a good visual for what we think of as the communion of saints. That it's all believers from all times that have ever lived and are living now, all in communion together, regardless of being separated even by that veil of death. So this congregation is probably the one in which I have had the chance to do the most number of field trips and things to various faith communities. We've done it now with a couple of confirmation classes and one adult class. But the very first time I ever started doing that with a confirmation class was at the congregation prior to serving here in Manchester. And one of the places we went to was a relatively new Orthodox church in Ann Arbor. It was St. Nicholas. In fact, it was so new that there were still a lot of blank spaces on the walls where they still had yet to pay for and fill in with more iconography. And it was really cool. The priest there was a younger guy, and he basically steered the whole sermon that morning toward our confirmation class sitting up front. Told folks that, they could listen in and they would probably learn a thing or two about their own Orthodox faith. And then after the service was over, he did a question and answer period, and people stayed around for that as well. The congregation decided they kind of wanted to be a part of that too. And so some of the kids had questions and the adults, and some of their own congregation had questions. And one of the things that he had mentioned in the midst of the sermon that day was that there was a brand new canonized Orthodox saint, and he was from Africa. And he'd been given a Greek name, and I can't remember what the Greek name was anymore. And he said that the tradition was when somebody was canonized as a saint that they were given a new name, and that because they were a Greek Orthodox church, it was always a Greek name. And so I decided that I would be a bit of a gadfly, and I asked the question, I said, so why is it that the church feels like they have to give the person not only a different name, but a Greek name in order for them to be official as a saint? And the young priest smiled, and he turned off his wireless mic. He said, I don't need the uppers hearing this. And he said, I don't think we really need to. I long for the day when saints in Africa and Asia and wherever they are allowed to keep their own names, because I believe God accepts everybody just as they are. That sainthood transcends those boundaries of culture and ethnicity. If you're a believer, you're a believer. If you're a saint, you're a saint. When we hear saint, we think of those official canonized people, right? We think of the capital S saints, right? The ones that churches are named after. But little s saints is what we're talking about today in the communion of saints. Anyone who is a believer, anyone who is among the faithful, we all gathered in this space today are saints. Not in the way that it often gets used out on the street, but in the sense that we are all part of this family of God. So when I first started in ministry in '94, I had a church in Detroit, Ford Memorial. It was right on Warren Avenue between Southfield and Greenfield, kind of at the halfway road, Asbury Park. And I was sort of lonely. There were not too many other Methodist churches around. My main faith relationship was with Father Rick at St. Christopher's. It was, at that point, largely an old Polish Catholic neighborhood, and Ford Memorial got all the people that got kicked out of St. Christopher's. If you were a renegade from St. Chris's, well, you could be a Methodist, but, it was all right. And Father Rick and I did lots of joint funerals together. He was a good guy. He actually let me shake the holy water sometimes, too. That was kind of fun. But Juanita Ferguson was our district superintendent at that time, and I think she knew that this was going to be a bit of a rough first assignment and that I was kind of on my own. And so she asked me to serve on the Detroit West District Council on Ministries, so that I had kind of another little group of clergy that I was meeting with on a regular basis. I don't think the council really needed my help so much as she wanted me to be a part of that. And there were some really cool people on that group that I've continued to keep in touch with. My friend Eric Stone was on there, Pete Harris, who I served with later in another community, Paula Tim, bunch of really cool people. And one of the coolest of the people that was on there, his name was Elias Mumbiro. He was originally from Zimbabwe and had come here and was pastoring on the Detroit West District. And we did a lot more than biz in those district council on ministries meetings. We would do all the biz that we had to do, but we really shared a lot of personal stories together. It was kind of a support group as well as a functioning ministry group. And he shared the story about the missionary coming to his home in Mutare, Zimbabwe, and that when he was converted and baptized, they gave him a Christian name, Elias, but that his given name was Namo. And we all came to the conclusion that Namo was every bit as Christian as Elias. And so whenever I would see him at annual conference, I'd holler across the room, "Yo, Namo!" And he would look over and he'd smile and he'd wave back. Sainthood, being a part of the family of God, transcends those boundaries of culture and ethnicity and nationality. I've had more than our fair share of funerals lately, at least it feels like it. Yesterday I had the honor and privilege of officiating across the street for Barbara Miller's funeral. Barbara was a long-time teacher here in the community for many years. Elizabeth Street Stadium. Is Carol here this morning? There was another one of the schools. Also a reading consultant. Wonderful, wonderful lady. And one of the things that her family talked about was that she loved making things beautiful. She loved decorating, whether it was her house or the yard or the classroom. She also had it was a kind of a convoluted family situation for somebody trying to put together the eulogy and trying to do a chronology. Her first husband had passed away. Her second husband, she had divorced, and her third husband was there. And there were multiple kids and stepkids and yada, yada, yada. And the more that I listened to them all talk, however, the more I realized it really wasn't going to matter at all to try to sort any of that out. They were one of those very, I think, rare families where, as mixed as it was, everybody loved each other. All the exes hung out together and did stuff, and it was great. I didn't have to worry about sorting through the flow chart at all. And I remember mentioning as one of the lessons of her life that not only did she make things beautiful, but she made relationships beautiful. And I charged those folks who were of her family and friends to go and do the same. Take that same level of intentionality that Barbara did to make the world around you a lovelier, brighter, and better place. Not long ago, right in this very spot, we did a service celebrating the life of Linda Nixon. She had wonderful testimony to bring from her life. The girls learned as they were sorting through stuff that she had saved just about every imaginable certificate and award that she'd ever earned, but she never displayed them. She never earned those things in order to show off. Her pride in accomplishment was not about making herself feel good, but it was about making a difference and being able to use those things to improve the world around her. She shows us the Christian side of what pride can look like, that pride doesn't have to look like arrogance, but pride can look like accomplishment in wanting to serve and do for the world. Today we'll celebrate after church, we'll celebrate the life of Irene Reamer. Spoiler alert, I'm going to compare her a little bit to Ruth. Ruth, who was so faithful in taking care of Naomi. Irene lived a life where she never got married herself, but she stayed at home and faithfully took care of each of her parents in succession as they grew ill. And Irene was constantly taking care of people throughout her life. And while in these last little bits of time, Sally, you took care of her. Prior to that, she did a great deal in also caring for you. And what a beautiful lesson her life is for us. This is one of the things about the communion of saints, too, is that the communion of saints, just like Psalm 45 says, one generation shares, praises, and witnesses, and the next learns and responds. So from those that have gone before us, we have so much to glean, so much to gain. The communion transcends culture, ethnicity, time, and even death. All right. So while this communion is radically inclusive that way on the one hand, it is a communion of saints, believers, the faithful, people set apart. And if we count ourselves among the saints, one of the things that the communion of saints imposes upon us is that our faith ought to be our primary worldview, the lens through which we look at all the rest of life. Now, each of us probably in our own families, we have certain family values that we carry forward, and we try to pass on to our kids. I know one thing that Jen and I told our kids: you don't have to be geniuses. There are always going to be people in every spot that are smarter than you or better than you at something else. But you will do well to work hard and to follow through on all your commitments. And following through will do you a world of good. And that certainly is a good value. But we don't dare let that sort of value get in the way of faith's imperative to help those in need. Sometimes we use those values of working hard that we impose upon ourselves. We turn them into judgments on what other people are or aren't doing. Faith insists we treat others with grace and we refrain from judgment. Bob Erickson tells a wonderful story that I use over and over again about delivering one of the Lions' Christmas baskets. And the address that he was given took him to this large, rather fancy-looking house. And his first thought, understandably, as probably would have been mine, was, does this house really need a Christmas basket? But he faithfully unloaded stuff from the back of the van and took it up to the door. And as the door opened, there was a woman there who was just crying. And he set the stuff down on the counter and sat down with her, and she shared the story about how she had just been divorced. The house was all she had. She didn't have the wherewithal to pay the mortgage for it, and she had medical bills to deal with, and life was rough. We just never know on the surface what people's stories are. We carry these narratives of who is and who isn't deserving. Those values we need to look at through the eyes of faith, which say, that's never been the way that God looks at us. Compared to God, there isn't one of us who's deserving, and yet grace is abundant to each and every one. Not even our economic ideologies stand up to the worldview of faith, right? Whatever they are. Free market principles have enabled free trade and in the aggregate a measure of prosperity and peace. I think probably on the whole it's better than a lot of systems. But faith demands that we ask, where does the love of money, the monetization and commodification of all things do damage, create evil situations, prevent us from adequately caring for one another, especially the most vulnerable among us? Last Sunday, I can't even remember why I had stayed around. I was around after church for some period of time until like my grandmother would say, until all the cows went home, or until the last dog was hung, or one of those crazy Kansas things. And so I was walking out the door, a guy who I should know, because I recognize his face and he recognizes me. It's not Mark Konopnicki, because I recognized him, but another one of the NOTA drivers. And he stopped with the NOTA bus, and so we just stopped and jawed for a while. And I could tell that in talking with him, there were probably a number of things politically that we wouldn't necessarily agree on, and that's all right. But I could tell that his heart was in the right place. He really views his job driving for NOTA as a ministry. He's gotten to know a lot of the folks that he drives, and he really feels their pain as they've suffered through COVID and the vagaries of relatives in the nursing center. Really, really good guy. And we both could agree that we as a society have somehow really failed our elderly. That unless we have means, there are so many folks that fall through the cracks. Doesn't faith demand that there be certain things that we prioritize that aren't subject to the vagaries of money and wealth? That we just all bond together and care? A very similar conversation this last week with Brian Thome. He and Debbie are both very forthright about some of the difficulties they have with their son Jason, who has mental illness. In fact, they are so forthright that they often speak at and lead NAMI sessions, National Association of Mental Illness, I believe it is. We had a conversation, and Brian is totally free market guy, capitalist to the core. But he says, that we have really, as a society, failed to treat our mentally ill and to support their families. You would think that there would be a way. I think faith calls us to find a way to do just that. Sometimes our own personal and family values are challenged by the worldview of faith. Sometimes our economic ideologies are challenged by the worldview of faith. Certainly our political sensibilities are challenged by the worldview of faith. For instance, how does faith square with our political language of rights? A language which dominates, I'll say, both sides of the political and ideological spectrum, right? From abortion rights to gun rights. Rights language clearly puts the self at the center. And this simply doesn't jibe with the perspective of faith, where God must always be at the center. Now, when we think about the Great Commandment, at least I usually think about it linearly. And I will assume maybe you do as well, because we all read from left to right, unless you're reading Hebrew. We say, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. So we kind of read God, neighbor, self. I've got a different little visual I want to stick up here. What if we looked at it as concentric circles? Instead of from left to right, that we put God at the center, neighbor, and then self. What are the implications of that? That self is very much on the periphery. It's important, it's there, but it's on the periphery, and God is at the center. And how do we get to God? There's no way to get to God unless you go through neighbor. The epistle of 1 John says it over and over again. Whoever says, I am in the light while hating a brother or sister is still in the darkness. Those who say, I love God and hate their brothers or sisters are liars. One other implication from this is that if the church is the body of Christ, and if Jesus is uniquely present in the least of these, his brothers and sisters are neighbors, right? The blue section of the chart, according to Matthew 25, then this graph reveals a new depth of meaning to Jesus' words from the Gospel of John. No one comes to the Father but by me. No one comes to the Father except through love of and service to me in your neighbors, which for us is both the body of believers and the least of these, our sisters and brothers. So yes, the communion of saints transcends culture, ethnicity, time, even death, but it also demands allegiance to a worldview formed through faith in Jesus Christ, a worldview that sets us apart from competing value systems and demands radical love, a love which puts ourselves on the periphery, God at the center, and our neighbors and their needs along the road to God, that road that the Good Samaritan traveled from Jerusalem to Jericho, the road from here to heaven, the road from self to God. So let us follow in the steps of all those who have journeyed that road before us, that great company of saints to which grace has welcomed us and to which our faithful response aspires. As the psalm concluded, all your works shall give thanks to you, O Lord, and all your saints shall bless you. We shall speak of the glory of your kingdom and tell of your power, to make known to all people your mighty deeds and the glorious splendor of your kingdom. For your kingdom, O God, is an everlasting kingdom. Your dominion endures over all and throughout all generations. Amen.